to Autumn by John Keats. So Ode to Autumn was published as an ode. It connects with other odes that Keats wrote in the same year of 1819, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Indolence, Melancholy, Ode to an Urn. But he didn't call To Autumn an ode, he just has that basic noun phrase, to autumn, and he published it, in fact, in 1820. And it comes after a very long, hot summer. When you approach any poem, and if you've seen any of the other commentaries I've done, it's always the same, you need a strategy just to start you off, to start writing your essay. And one of the first aspects of the strategy is look at rhyme scheme, then look at metre, and then you can work out a little bit about the form of the poem, and you have a few first sentences for your essay. So the first thing is rhyme scheme. A, B, back to A, and this is the way that we annotate a rhyme scheme, simply by using the alphabet. The first rhyme is A, the second is B, and you can run all the way through a poem like that. Usually you only need to look at the first stanza. This one's a little bit different from the other odes, but nevertheless you can see that there is some significant rhyme. A, B, A, C, D, E. So now we've got C, D, E. We're having to look to see where else there are rhymes. F. And then it comes back to E. And then we've got D, bees and trees. Cease, also D. And then finally cells and shells. So if you can see that a poem rhymes in a formal way, there's a clear attempt by the poet to make the ends of a line rhyme rather than use blank verse or internal rhyme or any of the other aspects of rhyming that you can use. This is a formal rhyme scheme. He's set a technique, he's set a style, and he's going to stick with it throughout the poem, roughly. So the next thing to look at then is metre, which basically means beat. How many syllables are there in a line? What beat does that make? And in this case there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 beats per line, 10 syllables per line, which is 5 pairs of feet. That's what they're called in poetry, which basically means that the poem is in iambic pentameter. Finally, it's worth looking at how many lines there are in a stanza, which means verse. And there are, in this case, 11 lines per stanza. The combination of iambic pentameter and formal rhyme scheme suggests a form of sonnet, and certainly in the other odes that formal rhyme scheme is more clear, and that formal rhyme scheme is more obvious, and it links more to the idea of a sonnet. But it's not a sonnet, because a sonnet is of one stanza, a 14-line poem, often 8 and 6, sometimes 4 quatrains and a couplet, depending on who's writing it and what style they choose. So we've got something to say. It's a bit like a sonnet. It's got more than one stanza. It's got a formal rhyme scheme. It works in iambic pentameter, and it is a song of praise or a poem of praise to a particular season. So not an abstract concept like indolence, nor a thing like an urn, but a season. So once you've approached a poem with that strategy, rhyme scheme, metre and form, you've got a few things to say about it. You've got a little bit of context, written in 1819, published in 1820, the last of many odes that he wrote that summer. Now you can start talking about what the poem itself says. And in this case, the first line is very famous. season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. It's become a cliche. It's become something that we say about autumn often, almost every year. Someone will say, oh, it's autumn season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. Because, as a line, it sums up what autumn is. It is misty. It is kind of mellow. The colours are mellow. And, of course, it's fruitful because it's the time when everything that's been growing from spring through the summer is harvested and picked, and the animals are storing up for the winter, as are we. So it's actually a very genial season, and that line has become its mantra, if you like, a cliche that people use all the time. A little bit like in the bleak midwinter from the hymn of that title. So alongside the very famous line is some decent alliteration: mists, mellow, followed by maturing sun. That also helps to make it memorable. Keats likes to use compound adjectives and compound nouns. This is a compound noun. Close bosom friend is, of course, personification and a compound noun. And then the line carries on, and I haven't highlighted it here, but it is on the PDF that you can download. Conspiring with him, and that's the personification of the season and the sun, which is him. So around the thatches, with the fruit vines that round the eaves of thatch, or the thatched eaves, he also inverts that a bit so as he can have the rhyme scheme with sun, run and sun. With fruit, the vines that run round the thatch eaves might be the better way to say that grammatically, but then he wouldn't get the rhyme. And then he uses premodifiers: mossed cottage, hazel shells. So the adjectives premodify the noun to give us an atmosphere, a sense of that mist and mellow fruitfulness. And it's strong imagery. You can see the thatched eaves, you can see the trees covered in moss and the hazelnuts on the ground. And it's full of imagery of plenty. And there's a little bit more alliteration here: fill all fruit. And there's a little bit of internal rhyme in to swell the gourd and plump the hazel shells. You've got swell and shell, which just carries on this sense of rhythm, this sense of alliteration. Everything links really to make a complete feeling of mellow mists, or mists and mellow fruitfulness. And then there is some anthropomorphism, because the bees are thinking that summer will never cease, but in fact it is going to finish soon. It was a lovely summer, and that summer has all brimmed their clammy cells. I think that's a reference to the amount of honey that the bees have managed to put into their sticky honeycombs. So in the second stanza we have rhetorical questions. Who hath not seen thee oft amid thy store? So he's just asking who has not been aware of autumn. Again, that sense of personification from bosom friend to thee oft amid thy store. And this is a reference to the amount of fruitfulness at this time of year. And he knows that everyone has seen autumn at its best. Sometimes whoever seeks abroad may find thee sitting careless on a granary floor. It's a sense at the time when there is so much in the barn, and there is so much fruit in the pantry, and so much to turn into chutney or pickle, or to store and turn into bread, that it feels like you don't need to care about what winter brings, because you've got enough to survive through the winter until things start growing again. That's probably a slightly false sense of security, but at the time, on a mild autumn evening when the grain barn is full and the potatoes are in and the fruit is storing quietly in the pantry, you kind of think you're going to make it all the way through to spring without feeling hungry. This was back before the days of supermarkets. So Now we have a couple of compound adjectives. The hair soft lifted by the winnowing wind, kind of personifying autumn as a female here, maybe, or a long-haired man. I think there's some sense of the grain waving in the autumn evening, being winnowed, separating the wheat from the chaff as you throw it up. The bit you don't want to eat flies away, and the other bit falls to the ground and is collected. Or on a half-reaped furrow sound asleep, drowsed with the fume of poppies. So a half-harvested field in the furrow, some of it's left over because there's so much, and then drowsed with the fume of poppies is what you think it is. Reference to opium, a pleasurable sensation back in the days when opium was not illegal, although still just as addictive as it is today. While they hook spares the next wave. This is a reference to the harvest. This is very much a reference to the harvest. What gets done. Things get stored. Things get winnowed and separated. Some stuff gets left because it's difficult to harvest it all, and falls amongst the seeds, the poppy seeds, because if you look at the fields, even today, you'll see the poppy fields. The poppies grow between the wheat, or whole fields of poppies grow, and some of it is left. So the next wave and all its twined flowers, so flowers and wheat mixed. And sometimes, like a gleaner, there's a simile here. A gleaner is someone who collects the leftover wheat, someone who goes through the half-reaped furrow and picks up the wheat that's been left, perhaps put it in a basket on their head, steady thy laden head across a brook, and walks away with it. It's very much a biblical image that he's referring to in Ode to a Nightingale. He refers to Ruth and Naomi, who were gleaning because they were refugees and had no other way of getting food. So he has that sort of image in his mind. And then what is autumn without cider? Without the apples being pressed for cider. And that phrase, last oozings, hours by hours, is not just about the cider and the way you press the most juice out of the apples in order to start the cider. It's also kind of the last act of autumn, and it gives that impression that you've squeezed as much out of this fruitful time as you possibly can, and it won't be long before winter comes, and a glass of warm cider will be comforting. So in the third stanza, a few more rhetorical questions. Where are the songs of spring? Where are they? In addition to that, he adds a little non-verbal filler, where are they? Which makes the whole atmosphere a little bit more informal, kind of light, and it's sort of addressing autumn. You know, spring is a wonderful time. You know that summer is ahead. You know there are warm days ahead, and everybody gets cheerful and sings. And if you're autumn, if you are personified in autumn, you might feel a little bit miserable that the only thing you foreshadow is winter and cold and the miserable nights by the fire and the darkness. But Keats wants to sing the praise of autumn and say, think not of them, thou hast thy music too. There are beautiful things about autumn. For a lot of people, autumn is their favourite season. The summer is too hot, the spring too lively, winter too cold. But autumn has that sense of carelessness. There is plenty in the pantry, and there is still warmth, and there is still outdoors to enjoy. So Keats is reassuring autumn in this personification. You've got here a dash, tiny bit of enjambment. It is a 10-syllable line, but he wants you to pause perhaps for a minute before you carry on and start thinking about the weather, while barred clouds, which is a reference to the type of cloud you might get in the autumn, bloom the soft dying day. So again, the compound adjective of soft dying, a little bit of alliteration on dying day. He was very aware of nature and the weather. Nightingale is an example of that. And this poem, also a famous poem about autumn, and yet he was called a suburban poet by Byron and others of the Romantic poets. Cockneyfied was another word they used, which upset him a bit, but in the end his reputation outlived their comments. Soft dying, compound adjective, a little bit of alliteration, dying day, and again, stubble plains, compound noun. A wailful choir. This is now personifying those annoying little things known as gnats, but it's quite a cogent representation of gnats. It's quite a good personification. The little buzzing sound that they make sounds like morning, and and of course one of them you wouldn't be able to hear, but the choir, the number of them, creates that sound. And of course morning has that sense of dying. It foreshadows the coming of winter, as does soft dying. This stanza is more preoccupied with what's to come, and perhaps with the overarching metaphor of the idea that autumn is the precursor to death, and we often talk about someone in later life as having reached their autumn years. Little bit of sibilance with sallows and sinking, change of technique, but nevertheless very effective. And then some more alliteration and full-grown lambs loud bleat from hilly bourne. Again, a reference to the progress from spring to autumn, that the lambs have grown up now and they are able to bleat independently, and they are an aspect of autumn. They show the passing of the seasons. The full-grown lambs show the passings of the seasons. The hedge crickets sing, still a little bit of summer. They hang on in there. But then the redbreast whistles from the garden croft. The robin redbreast is very much the symbol of winter, and he heralds it as he becomes more evident in the autumn months. And of course the swallows, they gather and go, heading back off to Africa. In Keats's Nightingale, he's fully aware that the nightingale also does that. Again, an understanding of the way nature behaves. So this is a much more concrete poem perhaps than some of the other odes, like the one to melancholy and indolence. It's less philosophical perhaps than the urn. It's most like the ode to the nightingale. It's not particularly abstract. It's shorter than a lot. It's very aware of nature. It became very popular. Possibly it was written to be populist because he needed to earn some more money. And possibly it's a reflection on autumn because by this time he had come to understand that he too had tuberculosis. So he might very well be, or he was, in the autumn of his own life. He knew that there was not long left for him, which was very hard for him, having seen his brother die. His own life was now shortened. And in fact, he wrote to his brothers about a philosophy called negative capability, which is contained perhaps more in something like Nightingale, but it's here in this last stanza about the way autumn is now fading into a soft dying day. The gnats mourn, the light wind lives or dies. There is the hint of death, the foreshadowing of winter, which is kind of a death of the earth and is often associated with human death. Negative capability was that idea that Keats had, that man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. By that he meant that it's peculiar that human beings are able to understand and conceive of their own death and yet remain sane. And of course he had been a surgeon and was very aware that people had to face death and yet could remain philosophical, or could at least live day to day. While it wasn't happening to them, they could set it aside. But he did know that he was in the autumn of his own life at the age of 24.